The sky above Aethelburg is a perfect, starless black every single night. This is the Starfall, a mandatory government broadcast that blankets the city's dome with an artificial void. But tonight, something impossible happens. A single point of light pierces the static, a real star flickering for just a moment before it is swallowed again. This glitch is a crack in their reality, a glimpse of a truth that could shatter the Ministry's greatest lie. By the end of this story, you will unravel a conspiracy that reaches across the stars and discover the staggering reason a government would erase the cosmos from the sky. What would you do if everything you saw above you was a lie? Kalen's heart hammered against his ribs as he sprinted up the last flight of stairs. He burst onto the rooftop, the cold night air stinging his lungs, and scrambled toward the makeshift dome head built in secret. His hands trembled as he unlocked the hatch, his entire being focused on that single, impossible point of light. Peering through his scavenged telescope, he saw it again, clear and sharp against the manufactured void. It was not a trick of the eye or a system malfunction. It was a star, a real burning sun impossibly far away, and it was there. The Ministry's foundational lie, the story of the Starfall, crumbled in that single, silent moment of confirmation. He had to preserve this. Fumbling in his coat, he retrieved a forbidden data slate, its storage wiped clean of all official tracking software. He activated its recording function, capturing the star's steady, defiant glow. For a few precious seconds, the proof was his. Then a low, electric hum sliced through the silence. A sleek, black patrol drone descended from the gloom, its single red lens swiveling to lock directly onto him and his illicit device. The star chose that exact moment to vanish, snuffed out as if it had never been, the sky returning to its seamless, empty black. But Kalin had the recording. He turned and ran, the drone's searchlight painting the rooftop behind him as he fled down the fire escape. He clutched the data slate to his chest, a cold dread and a hotter hope warring within him. The Ministry claimed the stars were erased by a long-past cosmic event, a natural tragedy, but nature does not glitch. Nature does not send drones. That single point of light was not a memory. It was a message, and he was now the only one who had heard it. The data slate felt like a block of ice in his hands as Kaelen ducked into the stale, recycled air of the lower transit tunnels. Every shadow seemed to hold the red lens of a drone. Every echo of footsteps sounded like the approach of an enforcer. He had to get the recording to someone, anyone who could understand its significance, but trust was a currency no one in Aethelburg could afford. Days bled into one another, a tense blur of paranoia and dead ends, until a contact, a man who dealt in forbidden hardware, whispered a single name, Lyra. Find the Archivist in the old data hub near the geothermal vents. She asks questions about the sky. The data hub was a tomb for forgotten knowledge, a cavernous space humming with the heat of the vents and the ghostly flicker of decommissioned servers. Kaelen found her tucked between two towering server racks, her face illuminated by the pale blue light of a terminal displaying streams of corrupted code. She was younger than he expected, her eyes holding a weary intelligence that seemed to absorb the entire room. She did not look up as he approached, her fingers never pausing on the interface. "You are the one who saw the glitch," she stated, her voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the mechanical hum. "I have been monitoring the Ministry's data streams. Their anomaly alerts spiked that night. They know." Kalen's breath caught. "How could you know that?" She finally turned, her gaze piercing, "Because the stars were not erased, Kaelen. They were hidden. The Ministry does not fear a forgotten past. They fear a future the stars would reveal." Her words hung in the hot, heavy air, reframing his entire world. The Starfall was not a memorial. It was a cage. With a fluid motion, she ejected a small, scarred date chip from her terminal and pressed it into his palm. Its surface was warm, and a hairline fracture ran along its edge, corrupting most of its data. This is all that remains of the Veritas transmission, a beacon from a derelict satellite that went silent decades ago. It holds the coordinates to its location. It was the first listening post designed to hear the stars. They silenced it, just as they are trying to silence you. He stared at the damaged chip, a key to a lock he never knew existed. But why? What could be so terrifying up there? Lyra's expression was grim. I have only fragments, whispers in the data. Something about our origin, a truth that would unravel their control completely. Finding that satellite is the first step to understanding, but you must move quickly. The Ministry's enforcers are not just patrol drones. There are people, hunters, who specialize in silencing curiosities like yours. They are already closing in. Her eyes darted toward the hub's entrance, a silent warning. This chip is your only map. Do not let it fall into the void. The hope he had carried since the rooftop now had a direction, but it was a path leading directly into the darkness the Ministry had created. The scarred data chip felt like a burning ember in his pocket as Kaelen slipped back into his apartment. He had barely sealed the door when the thunderous knock came, a sound that was not a request but a promise of violence. The door splintered inward before he could even process moving. Black-armored peacekeepers flooded the small space, their faceless helmets scanning the room with a chilling, mechanical efficiency. They moved with a coordinated purpose, overturning furniture, ripping panels from the walls, their silence more terrifying than any shouted command. This was not a routine inspection. This was a purge. His heart seized as one of them zeroed in on his workbench, seizing the very telescope that had started it all, crushing its delicate optics under a heavy boot. They knew everything. He had minutes, maybe seconds. Thinking of Lyra's warning about hunters, he acted on pure instinct, scrambling toward the kitchen and the narrow grate of the old ventilation shaft. The whine of a stun baton filled the air, searing past his shoulder as he pried the grate loose. He squeezed into the cold, dark metal duct just as a gloved hand clawed at his ankle. He kicked free, tumbling into the darkness as the shouts of the peacekeepers were muffled by the echoing metal around him. He was running, crawling, scrambling through the city's arteries, the only proof of his sanity clutched tight in his fist. They were not just erasing a glitch, they were erasing him. The Ministry's peace was a fragile illusion and he had just shattered it. To protect their secret, they would turn the entire city upside down. His only hope, his only path to survival, now lay in the fractured data on a single chip. He had to find the Veritas satellite, and he had to find it first. The metal ducts gave way to dripping tunnels that ran with rust-colored water. This was the world beneath Aethelburg, a labyrinth of forgotten maintenance shafts and crumbling infrastructure, where the hum of the city above was a distant, oppressive drone. Kaelen moved through the gloom, guided by whispers and the fractured data on Lyra's chip. It led him to a sealed hydro-generator vault, its massive door scarred by time. A single, faded symbol was etched near the handle, a circle with 8 points radiating outward. A crude echo of the thing he had seen in the sky. He knocked, a sequence of taps that felt both foolish and dangerously loud. A panel slid open, revealing a pair of wary eyes. After a tense moment, the great door groaned inward. He was pulled into a cavernous space, lit by flickering emergency lamps and lined with salvaged tech. A dozen faces turned to him, their expressions a mixture of suspicion and a desperate, hungry hope. This was the refuge of the Star Seekers. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man named Jax with a network of scars across his knuckles, looked Kaelen up and down with open contempt. He gestured to a wall where faded, hand-drawn star charts were pinned next to official ministry bulletins declaring the artists insane or deceased. "You are not the first to come to us with fire in your eyes, boy," Jax said, his voice a low rumble. "Many have tried to prove the stars exist. All are gone. The Ministry does not tolerate questions. They vanish you, or they break you until you denounce your own memories." Kaelen said nothing. He simply held up the data slate, its screen dark. Then he tapped the play command. The recording was brief, just a few seconds of the star's unwavering light against the black. In the silence of the vault, its silent testimony was deafening. Jack's defiant posture faltered. The hardness in his eyes cracked, replaced by something raw and ancient. He reached out, his calloused fingers hovering just above the screen as if he could feel its warmth. For a long time he just stared. Finally, he looked at Kaelen, and the resistance leader was gone, replaced by a man who had been waiting decades for a sign. "This changes everything," Jax breathed. He turned to his people. "Prep the Wraith. We are going beyond the dome." The Wraith was their one asset, a battered transport freighter retrofitted with stolen Ministry cloaking tech. It was their only chance to slip past the orbital patrols and reach the coordinates on the damaged chip. As the small crew swarmed over the ship, Jax handed Kaelen a worn jumpsuit. "You have given us more than proof," he said, his voice low. "You have given us a target. But remember, out there, the sky is not just empty. It is a hunting ground. And now, the hunters know we are coming." The Wraith shuddered as it pierced the upper atmosphere, its cloaking field straining against the constant sensor sweeps of the orbital patrols. Ahead of them, the city's energy barrier shimmered like a colossal, silent wall of heat haze, a dome so vast it seemed to curve with the world itself. Lyra was already at a secondary console, her fingers flying across the interface, jacked directly into a forgotten maintenance port she had mapped from the old data archives. "This is not a shield," she said, her voice tight with concentration. "It is a filter. It projects the starfall inward, but its primary function is to block specific wavelengths of light from the outside, scrubbing the cosmos clean. It does not protect us, it cages us." The console flickered, and a cascade of authorization codes scrolled past. For a terrifying moment, the entire ship groaned, alarms blaring as a patrol vessel scan washed over them. Then, with a sound like tearing fabric, a temporary rift opened in the shimmering veil. The Wraith shot through the gap, and the universe returned. One moment, there was the familiar, suffocating black. The next, a billion points of light erupted into being, so dense and brilliant they defied comprehension. It was not a void. It was an ocean of fire, a tapestry of diamond dust scattered across an infinite velvet dark. Nebulae glowed with impossible colors, and a band of faint, milky light arched overhead. A river of stars so vast it stole the breath from Kaelen's lungs. He was not looking at a memory or a recording, he was seeing the true sky in all its terrifying, beautiful glory. The Ministry had not just hidden the stars. They had hidden a truth of such staggering scale that it made their entire civilization feel like a single, fragile candle flame in an endless, blazing cathedral. The lie was not just about what was up there. It was about what they were down here. The sheer scale of it was a physical blow, a silent roar of light that filled the viewport and threatened to swallow his sense of self. Kaelen could only stare, his mind reeling, trying to find a place for a single city, a single life in that impossible vastness. Then a sharp, static hiss cut through the ship's comms, resolving into a voice, broken and strained. "They are watching. Find the beacon." The words were clear, a desperate warning from the void, and then the signal dissolved back into meaningless noise. Before anyone could speak, space itself seemed to ripple a kilometer off their starboard bow. A sleek, predatory shape shimmered into existence, its hull matte black and bristling with weapon ports. A Ministry warship, one they had never even known existed. A voice, cold and synthetic, boomed over an open channel. "Unauthorized vessel. Cut your engines and prepare to be boarded. Resistance will be met with lethal force." A blinding lance of energy seared past the Wraith's hull. a warning shot that illuminated their cloaking field in a cascade of failing sparks. "We are not going back," Jax snarled, his hands flying across the pilot's console. He slammed the thrusters to full, hurling the small ship into a violent evasive roll as another blast rocked them, scorching the outer armor. Their only hope was a debris field ahead, a chaotic swirl of asteroids and frozen gases left over from some ancient cataclysm. The Wraith dove into the storm, a minnow fleeing a shark. Alarms screamed as Jax weaved through the tumbling mountains of rock, the warship relentlessly pursuing, its larger frame unable to match their agility, but its powerful guns chipping away at the asteroids around them. The warning echoed in Kalen's mind, a ghost in the machine. They are watching. The Ministry's reach was not confined to the dome, it stretched out here into the very freedom they had just discovered, and it was armed for war. That single, distorted message was their only thread of guidance, a plea from someone or something that knew the true nature of the cage. Rocks the size of cities tumbled past the viewport in a dizzying ballet of silent destruction. Jax wrestled with the controls, his knuckles white, as a volley of plasma fire from the warship vaporized a nearby asteroid into a cloud of superheated dust. The Wraith shuddered violently, its alarms a constant, screaming chorus. "We cannot keep this up," Jax yelled over the din. "They are hurting us." Kaelen, gripped by a cold, sharp clarity, fumbled the damaged data chip from his pocket and slammed it into a console port. The screen flickered, the corrupted data struggling to render a navigational path through the chaos. "It is not a map of the field," he shouted. "It is a path through it." "The chip is plotting a course." He began calling out vectors, his voice tight. "Hard to port now. Dive 300 meters." Jax obeyed without question, swinging the ship into a gut-wrenching descent that sheared past a spinning monolith of iron and ice. Meanwhile, Lyra was jacked into another terminal, her eyes scanning the fragmented transmission, sifting through the digital ghosts. The words were broken, the syntax corrupted, but a pattern was emerging. "The beacon is not just a satellite," she said, her voice cutting through the panic. "It is an Archivist-class relay, older than the Ministry itself. It was part of a network, a system designed not just to listen but to speak." Her eyes widened as the final piece of the code unscrambled itself in her mind. "If we can reach it and transmit our recording, its broadcast power is immense. It could send the truth of the stars to every colony, every ship, every receiver in this sector of the galaxy. It would not just prove the stars are there. It would tell everyone at once. Their desperate flight was no longer just about escape. It was about seizing a microphone with the power to shatter 1,000-year silence. But their moment of revelation was shattered by a new, more insistent alarm. The warship, realizing it could not safely follow them deeper, had launched a swarm of smaller craft. 4 tracker drones, sleek and fast, shot from its underbelly, their sensor arrays already painting the Wraith's hull. "They are on us," Jax growled, weaving around another asteroid. "These things are faster, and they will stick to us like shadows. We cannot outrun them and we cannot fight them." The drones closed in with terrifying speed, their silent, single-minded pursuit a more immediate threat than the warship's distant guns. They were being hunted, and their only hope now lay at the end of a broken path through a field of rubble, a destination that promised both salvation and a confrontation with the very forces that had erased the sky. The tracker drones swarmed the Wraith, their plasma cannons searing glowing scars across the ship's already battered hull. An explosion rocked the bridge, and acrid smoke filled the air. They were being torn apart, piece by piece. Jack's hands were a blur on the console, his face a mask of grim determination. He knew the numbers, and the numbers did not lie. The Wraith could not survive this. His eyes met Kalen's across the shuddering bridge, and in that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. This was the end of their flight, but not the end of their mission. With a final, decisive command, Jax slammed the ship's thrusters, wrenching the Wraith into a violent 180 turn. They were no longer running. They were charging directly toward the pursuing warship. The drones, caught off guard, scrambled to reorient. Jax opened a short-range channel, his voice calm and clear over the roar of straining metal and blaring alerts. Kaelen, Lyra, get to the escape pod. Now the coordinates are locked in. Go. The truth is more important than one life. It is more important than all of our lives. Before Kaelen could protest, Jax severed the link. The viewport filled with the terrifying, weapon-studded profile of the Ministry warship. Jax did not fire his own pathetic guns. Instead, he pointed the Wraith's nose at the enemy's bridge and pushed the engines far beyond their red line. The freighter became a missile, a final, defiant act of sacrifice. The warship, realizing the suicidal intent, unleashed its full broadside. A storm of energy bolts tore into the Wayland, but it was too late to alter its trajectory. The last thing Kaelen saw before the escape pod blasted away was a silent, expanding fireball where the Wraith and its brave pilot had been. A brief, man-made star that momentarily outshone the galaxy. The shockwave from the explosion battered their small pod, but it also created the chaos they needed. In that single, terrible, heroic moment, Jax had drawn every eye and every weapon. The path was clear. Lyra, her face pale but her hands steady, initiated the jump sequence. Space itself seemed to stretch and warp around the pod as it leapt into the blinding tunnel of light speed, hurling them toward the silent, waiting satellite and the truth it guarded. The jump ended not with a flash, but with a profound and sudden silence. Their pod drifted into the shadow of a colossal, skeletal structure, a relic from a time before the lie. This was the Veritas, the beacon, and it was dead. Its vast solar arrays were shattered, torn away by some ancient violence, and its hull was scarred by micrometeorite impacts over countless silent years. They maneuvered the pod into a gaping hangar bay, the magnetic clamps engaging with a tired, grinding sound that echoed through the vacuum. The air that hissed into the chamber was thin and stale, carrying the metallic tang of decayed electronics and the cold of deep space. Every system was on emergency backup, the lights flickering like a dying heartbeat as they moved through the dark, frozen corridors. Their footsteps echoed in the tomb like quiet, a sound that seemed to offend the profound stillness. They found the central archive chamber, its massive observation window looking out onto a breathtaking, star-dusted void. Lyra went to work at the primary console, her fingers coaxing a sliver of power from the failing core. A screen flickered to life, its glow pale and sickly. Text scrawled across it, the final logs of the station's last chief scientist, a man named Dr. Aris Thorne. His words were a ghost speaking across the decades. The Ministry did not erase the stars out of malice. His log began, the text appearing slowly, painfully. They did it out of fear. Our long-range arrays detected a signal, a complex pattern buried in the cosmic background radiation. It was not a greeting. It was a warning, a single, repeating message of imminent systemic collapse. The Ministry believed the truth would cause a total societal breakdown, panic. Anarchy, so they built the dome, not to protect us from a forgotten cataclysm, but to hide us from a future one. They gave us peace through ignorance. Kaelen felt the floor drop out from under him. The lie was so much worse than he had imagined. It was not about control for power's sake. It was a desperate, monstrous act of paternalism. But then the final entry loaded. The timestamp showing it was the very last thing Thorne ever recorded. His tone had changed from resigned explanation to horrified realization. I was wrong, we were all wrong. The signal is not a warning about some external threat. It is a diagnostic, a countdown. It is measuring the stability of local spacetime itself, and the reading is critical. The collapse is not coming from out there. It is being triggered from in here. Our existence in this region is fundamentally unstable. The Ministry did not just hide the stars. They hid a ticking clock. As the last word appeared on the screen, the console let out a final, sputtering crackle. The lights throughout the archive chamber died completely, plunging them into an absolute, suffocating blackness, the silent, cold truth of their extinction hanging in the air around them. A single emergency light flickered on above the console, its weak red glow illuminating the despair on their faces. Then, with a pained hum, the main screen shuddered back to life, displaying the final, corrupted fragment of Dr. Thorne's log. The words scrolled with agonizing slowness. The signal originates from a rogue pulsar, a neutron star ejected from its galaxy and now traveling through the void. Its radiation wave is not a slow decay. It is a physical storm, a wave of energy that will sterilize this entire sector in 3 of its rotational cycles. The Ministry erased the stars not to hide the collapse, but to hide the source itself. Lyra's breath caught in her throat, her eyes wide with a terrible, dawning comprehension. "They are not protecting us from panic," she whispered, the words sharp and cold. "They are hiding their own failure. They have no plan to stop it. They never did." This was not a shield. It was a tombstone they placed over an entire civilization, giving us a quiet, ignorant end instead of a chance, however slim, to fight for our lives. The scale of the deception was breathtaking. The Ministry had looked into the face of annihilation and chosen not to warn the people they governed, not to rally every mind and every resource to find a solution. They chose instead to build a beautiful, peaceful cage and wait for the end. The silence in the dead satellite was no longer just the absence of sound. It was the sound of a countdown, one that had been ticking away in the dark while the people of Aethelburg lived their lives, completely unaware that their sky was a lie and their future had already been stolen. The hope they had carried, the truth they had fought so hard to reveal, had curdled into something far more bitter. They had not found a path to salvation. They had simply reached the dead end of a monstrous, calculated lie. The weak red light of the archive chamber suddenly blazed with a harsh, white glare as 3 massive shapes shimmered into existence just beyond the shattered observation window. A full Ministry fleet, their matte black hulls blocking out the starscape, had emerged from hyperspace to surround the dead satellite. The lead ship, a dagger-shaped command cruiser, dwarfed the one that had destroyed the Wraith. A voice, cold and utterly devoid of emotion, crackled over the beacon's failing comm system. "This is Commander Valerius of the Ministry Vengeance. You have trespassed into forbidden space and accessed proscribed data. Surrender the recording and the archive core. There will be no further warning. Ignorance is stability." Kalin felt a cold fury rise within him, burning away the despair. He moved to the console, his voice steady as he opened a channel in response. "Stability built on lies is not peace, Commander. It is a prison, and we are done being your prisoners." Lyra was already moving, her hands flying across the engineering panels. She rerouted the last dregs of power from the station's life support and non-essential systems, funneling everything into the thermal regulation unit for the main reactor. The core was cold and dead, but its coolant lines were still pressurized. Venting the core will create a massive energy signature and a cloud of supercooled plasma, she said, her words quick and precise. "It will blind their sensors for a few seconds, maybe 10. It is our only chance." They initiated the sequence. Alarms they had not heard before screamed through the corridors as the satellite shuddered violently. Deep within its skeletal frame, massive valves spun open. A geyser of brilliant, freezing blue plasma erupted from the Veritas' side, a temporary, artificial nebula blooming between them and the fleet. On the command ship's bridge, every sensor screen dissolved into a storm of static. For a handful of heartbeats, they were invisible. It was not a weapon, but a smokescreen, a final act of defiance using the corpse of the very truth they had come to find. In that brief window of chaos, their escape pod disengaged, its minimal energy signature lost in the raging plasma cloud. They were not heading for a jump point. That would be suicide. Instead, they plunged downward, aiming for the only cover available, the turbulent, radioactive atmosphere of a gas giant that hung in the system's shadow, a hiding place no sane pilot would ever attempt. Their escape pod shuddered violently as it punched through the upper atmosphere of the gas giant, the external cameras showing nothing but a churning, violent sea of orange and red ammonia clouds. Alarms blared, warning of hull stress and rising radiation levels. They were flying blind, their trajectory a desperate, uncontrolled fall into the storm. Then, as if the planet itself had decided to grant them a temporary reprieve, the clouds parted for a single moment. Ahead of them, nestled within a stable gravitational pocket, was a small, rocky planetoid. Its surface was not the smooth, barren rock they expected. It was covered in a forest of white satellite dishes, a graveyard of colossal radio telescopes all pointing in different directions, their metal skeletons bleached and pitted by millennia of cosmic dust. Lyra's breath hitched. She pulled up a fragment of an old star chart from the pod's limited database, her eyes darting between the screen and the viewport. "That is not a planetoid," she whispered, her voice filled with a kind of reverent awe. "It is an array, a Sector Alpha listening post. I thought they were all decommissioned, dismantled." The Ministry must have missed one, hidden here in the belly of this giant. The pod's failing systems gave them no choice. Kalin guided them toward the only flat surface he could find, a crumbling landing pad near the base of the largest dish. The landing was rough, the pod skidding to a halt amidst a shower of ancient dust and debris. When the airlock hissed open, the silence was absolute and profound. They stepped out onto a world of ghosts. The scale was humbling. The central dish towered over them like a man-made mountain, its surface a vast, cracked plain of metal panels. Smaller dishes dotted the landscape, their support structures leaning at precarious angles, slowly succumbing to time and gravity. Everything was frozen, preserved in the thin, cold air of this forgotten rock. Lyra immediately went to a nearby access terminal, using a portable power cell to jolt a flicker of life into its screen. Corrupted text scrolled past, but the core directory was still partially intact. "This was not just a listening post, Kaelen," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the stillness. "It was an amplifier, a relay station designed to boost faint signals from the deepest reaches of space and send them across the network." Her fingers traced a schematic on the dusty screen. "If we can power this array, we can link it to the Veritas satellite's final broadcast log. We would not just be sending a message from a single, dead beacon. We would be shouting the truth with 1,000 voices at once, using the Ministry's own abandoned infrastructure." The hope that had been crushed in the dead satellite began to flicker back to life, fragile but insistent. Here, in this graveyard of forgotten science, lay the tools to complete their mission. But the planetoid was a corpse, and its systems were skeletal. Powering the array would require a miracle, a feat of engineering that would test the limits of their knowledge and the last of their resources. They were no longer just messengers. They had become engineers of salvation, working against a clock they could not see, in a tomb the universe had forgotten. The silence of the array was a physical weight, broken only by the faint hum of Lyra's portable power cell. Then a deep, resonant tone vibrated through the metal floor beneath their feet. A console, thick with dust and seemingly dead for centuries, flickered to life. A holographic figure shimmered into being above it, an androgynous form woven from pale blue light, its features serene and impossibly ancient. Its voice echoed through the cavernous control room, not from a speaker, but from the very structure around them. "I am the Sentinel of the silent sky. The Ministry severed my link to the network long ago. I have been waiting." Kaelen could only stare, the reality of a functioning intelligence from a lost age freezing him in place. You have the key, the Sentinel continued, its luminous gaze seeming to look directly through him, to the date, slate, and the fractured chip he carried. But a key is useless without a door. To reactivate the beacon and complete the broadcast, you must bypass their central firewall on Aethelburg. The entire city dome is not just a shield. It is the firewall's primary node, routing all data through the Ministry's data core. The hologram shifted, resolving into a complex, three-dimensional schematic that hung in the air. It showed the familiar skyline of Aethelburg, but beneath it, pulsing like a diseased heart, was a labyrinth of energy conduits and data lines all converging on a single, heavily fortified structure deep within the government sector. This is the Nexus, the Sentinel said. The Ministry's control is absolute because their truth is the only data permitted to flow. To send your message, you must create a backdoor, a temporary breach in their defenses that will allow the array here to link directly with the Veritas satellite. It will be like trying to whisper a secret into the ear of a king surrounded by an army of guards. The schematic zoomed in, highlighting a vulnerability, a secondary maintenance conduit used for system diagnostics that was shielded from the main security protocols. It was a tiny crack, but it was a start. The Sentinel's light flickered, its form growing unstable. My power is finite and my time grows short. The coordinates and access codes are now yours. Remember, the firewall is not merely a program. It is watched by the curators, the Ministry's most loyal and dangerous enforcers. They do not just delete data. They eliminate those who carry it. With a final, soft pulse of light, the hologram vanished, leaving them alone in the dusty silence with the ghost of a plan and a map to the lion's den. They had come to the edge of known space to find their answer, only to learn that their only path forward led directly back to the very center of the cage. The silence left by the Sentinel was more deafening than the gas giant's storm. They had a map, a target, and a death sentence hanging over their entire civilization. Kaelen stared at the schematic of the Nexus, its defenses laid bare. Getting back into Aethelburg was impossible. Getting into the Ministry's central data core was suicide. And yet, a plan began to form in his mind, a desperate, fragile thread of an idea. He turned to Lyra, his voice low. We do not fight their strength. We use their own routine against them. Every week, automated supply ships run from the outer agricultural domes into the city. Their security protocols are lighter, their cargo bays crowded. We get on one, we hide in plain sight. Lyra was already nodding, her fingers tapping on her portable datapad. It is audacious enough to work. Their external scans look for weapons, for large energy signatures. They will not be looking for 2 more workers returning from a harvest shift. I can forge the ident chips. We will be ghosts in the machine. She worked for hours, meticulously crafting digital identities for them, weaving their biometrics into the personnel files of 2 low-level hydroponic technicians. The system would see them, recognize them, and log them as authorized. It was a perfect invisible key. Just as she finalized the forgeries, the console where the Sentinel had appeared flickered once more. A single line of text scrawled across the dusty screen, a final warning from the ghost in the machine. The firewall is not just code. It is protected by a loyalty algorithm. It does not just block data. It scans for subversive thought patterns, and when it finds them, it does not trigger an alarm. It triggers a neural wipe. It erases the dissenter's memories, leaving a hollow shell that believes only what the Ministry tells it to believe. You cannot simply bypass it. You must disable its core command. You must find the override key. The text paused, as if the ancient intelligence was gathering its last bit of strength. And the key is not a digital sequence. It is a physical token, a biocryptic device that confirms absolute authority. It is held only by the Minister of Truth himself. The screen went dark, this time for good. The air grew cold. Their plan to sneak into the city now felt like a minor hurdle. They had to infiltrate the most secure building on the planet, find a way to get close to the most powerful and protected man in the Ministry, and steal the one object that could unlock the truth from his person, all while avoiding a system that could literally erase their minds with a single scan. The mission was no longer about sending a message. It was a heist against the architect of their ignorance, and the price of failure was not just death, but the utter annihilation of everything they were. The air in the agricultural transport bay was thick with the smell of damp soil and recycled oxygen, a familiar scent that now felt like a mask. Kalin kept his head down, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs as the cargo shuttle descended through the city dome's energy field. The transition was a physical pressure, a sudden, suffocating quiet that replaced the vibrant hum of the stars. Outside the viewport, the sky was once again a perfect, seamless black, the Starfall broadcast erasing the universe as if their journey had never happened. It was a psychological blow, a cage door slamming shut behind them. Around them, other workers in identical gray coveralls murmured quietly, their conversations not about crop yields, but about the rumors. "Did you see the flicker last night? My cousin swears the static pulsed blue over the western sector. The Peacekeepers have been questioning people on my level." The unrest was a low, simmering heat beneath the city's cold, orderly surface. Every whispered word about sky glitches was a crack in the Ministry's foundation, proof that their control was not as absolute as it seemed. Kaelen felt the weight of the data slate hidden in his insulated lunch container, a cold, hard truth in a world built on warm, comfortable lies. He exchanged a glance with Lyra, her face a carefully neutral mask, but her eyes held the same coiled tension. They were walking into the lion's den, and the lions were already stirring. Exposure did not just mean capture. The Sentinel's final warning echoed in his mind. It meant having his very self scoured from his mind, becoming one of the hollow, placid citizens who never looked up, who never questioned. It was a fate worse than any physical death. As they filed out of the shuttle and into the sprawling transit hub, the monolithic spire of the Ministry of Truth dominated the skyline, a needle of polished black obsidian piercing the artificial night. That was their destination, the heart of the firewall, the seat of the man who held the key to their salvation. Every step forward was a step deeper into the machine that sought to erase them, and the murmurs of the crowd were the only fragile shield they had. The archive chamber was a cathedral of forgotten secrets, its air tasting of ozone and dust. Rows of crystalline data slates stood in silent formation, their surfaces dark until Lyra's touch coaxed one to life. It was the minister's personal log, a file buried so deep it was never meant to be found. His voice, stripped of its public grandeur and laced with a terrible weariness, filled the silent space. "I authorized the Starfall to buy us time, to prevent a global panic while we worked on a solution. But the evacuation protocols are a fiction. The Arks can hold less than 1% of our population. They are for the elite, the essential personnel, the architects of this lie. We are not saving humanity. We are saving a remnant." The recording paused, as if the man himself were gathering the strength to utter the final, damning truth. "The beacon was never a threat to our stability. It is the only artifact with the broadcast power to reach the generation ships on their long voyages. It is the people's only hope for a warning, for a chance, however remote, that someone out there might hear their story and remember we existed." The voice fell silent. And in that silence, a soft hydraulic hiss came from the chamber's entrance. The door slid open, and Minister Valerius himself stood there, his face a mask of cold shock that quickly hardened into grim recognition. He did not call for his guards. He simply stood, blocking their only exit, his eyes fixed on the date, the slate that had just narrated his deepest shame. His hand hovered over the calm piece on his lapel, a single touch away from condemning them to the neural wipe. But his finger did not press down. He saw the raw horror on their faces, the complete unraveling of their world, and for a moment, the unshakable Minister of Truth looked less like a ruler and more like a man trapped in the same nightmare he had created. "You were not supposed to find this," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of its official power. "You were only supposed to find the first lie, not the deeper one beneath it." The minister's hand fell away from his calm peace, a gesture of surrender that felt more dangerous than any threat. "I wanted to tell the truth," he said, his voice hollow. "From the very beginning, I argued for transparency, for mobilizing our entire scientific community. But the Council outvoted me. They chose secrecy, a quiet extinction for the many to save a privileged few. The override key you need is a biometric seal in my office safe. But the building has been on lockdown since your escape was detected. They know an internal breach is imminent. Help me expose this, and we can activate the beacon together." Kaelin's every instinct screamed that this was a trap, an elegant way for the minister to reclaim control and silence them permanently. Yet the raw, desperate hope in the man's eyes was not something a career politician could easily fake. He was risking everything with this confession. Lyra's gaze was a silent question, her trust in his judgment absolute. They had no other path, no other ally with this level of access. The minister needed their knowledge of the outside, and they needed his authority inside the fortress. It was a pact with the devil they had just unmasked, a temporary alliance built on a foundation of mutual betrayal and shared desperation. Kalin gave a single, sharp nod. "We do this together. But if this is a trick, the last thing you will see is that truth broadcast to every screen in the city before your guards can stop us." The minister did not flinch. He simply turned and led them deeper into the archive, toward a hidden service lift that bypassed the main security checkpoints. The lockdown was their greatest obstacle, but it was also their greatest cover. In the chaos of a manhunt, who would suspect the hunter was now helping the prey? The minister's office was a sanctuary of cold, polished metal and silent authority. He moved with a rehearsed calm to a panel on the wall, his back to them as he placed his palm on a scanner. For a single breathless second, Kaelen dared to believe the alliance was real. Then a low, piercing whine cut through the silence, and the room flashed with crimson light. The minister turned, his face a mask of pained resolve. "I am sorry," he said, his voice barely audible over the rising alarm, "but some lies are necessary for order." The doors hissed open, and black-armored peacekeepers flooded the room. There was no time to run, no chance to fight back. Rough hands seized Kaelen, wrenching his arms behind his back as a stun baton jammed into his side. The world dissolved into a nauseating blur of pain and blinding white light. He caught a final glimpse of Lyra, her eyes wide with a betrayal that cut deeper than any weapon, before a black bag was yanked over his head. They were dragged through corridors that echoed with the frantic bootsteps of their captors, the minister's final words echoing in the dark. Order, it was the ultimate justification, the shield behind which every monstrous act could hide. The mission, the truth, the stars themselves, all of it was being systematically erased, and they were being delivered to the very machine designed to do the erasing. He was thrown into a cold, sterile room, the bag ripped from his head. The walls were a seamless, glowing white, and in the center stood a chair, its crown a tangle of slender, needle-tipped wires. A memory-wipe chamber. This was not an execution, it was a cancellation. They would not just kill the messengers, they would unmake them, scouring their minds clean until even the memory of the stars was gone, until they were hollow citizens who never once dreamed of looking up. The peacekeepers forced him into the chair, the cold metal biting into his wrists and ankles. As the headpiece began to lower toward his temples, he had one final, desperate thought. They could take his memories, but they could not change the truth he had seen. The stars were still there, burning in the silent dark, waiting. The cold metal of the headpiece pressed against his temples. Kaelen closed his eyes, bracing for the void, for the unwriting of his own mind. Then the wall behind him exploded. A concussive blast of sound and shrapnel threw the Peacekeepers across the room, and the memory wipe chair sparked violently before going dead. Through the smoke and swirling debris, a familiar, broad-shouldered figure emerged, his face a roadmap of fresh scars and grim fury. Jax, he tossed a small, metallic object through the air. Kaelen caught it on pure reflex, his fingers closing around a smooth, warm biocryptic seal, the override key. "Go!" Jax roared over the screaming alarms and the sudden, deafening crackle of energy weapons. "We will hold them off." The Star Seekers, armed with scavenged plasma rifles and a righteous fury, poured into the breach, turning the sterile white corridor into a chaotic war zone. They fired from behind shattered walls and overturned medical carts, their disciplined cover fire pinning down the stunned Peacekeepers. Kalin did not hesitate. He grabbed Lyra's arm and they ran, ducking under searing bolts of plasma that scorched the walls where their heads had been just moments before. The path to the data core was now a gauntlet of smoke and strobe lights, but it was open. Jax and his rebels had become the storm, a calculated, beautiful chaos that gave them the one thing they needed most: a final, desperate chance. The corridor ended at a circular vault door, its surface humming with contained energy. This was the data core, the Nexus heart. Lyra jammed the Minister's biocryptic key into the central port. The massive door earized open with a deep, resonant groan, revealing a cavernous chamber dominated by a single, crystalline spire that pulsed with a soft, hypnotic blue light. This was the firewall, the mind of the lie itself. As they stepped inside, the air grew thick and heavy. The chamber dissolved around them, the walls and floor melting away into a perfect, soothing blackness. The familiar, starless sky of Aethelburg materialized above them, serene and reassuring. A warm, gentle voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere: "You are safe here. There is no danger, there are no stars. Come home to the peace we have built for you." The illusion was a physical pressure, a narcotic warmth seeping into Kalen's mind, promising to erase the fear, the struggle, the terrible knowledge. It offered the bliss of ignorance, the comfort of the cage. For a moment it was tempting. Then he saw Lyra stagger, her eyes glazing over as she reached for the illusory sky. He grabbed her arm, his voice a ragged shout against the seductive whisper. "Do not listen, it is not real." He focused everything on the memory of the true sky, the staggering, beautiful terror of a billion suns. He pictured Jack's sacrifice, the expanding fireball that was a final act of defiance. He looked up into the perfect, empty black and spoke, his words cutting through the false calm. "I have seen the stars, I choose truth over comfort." The illusion shattered like glass. The soothing voice twisted into a scream of static, and the chamber snapped back into existence. The crystalline spire flashed a violent red, then fell dark and silent. The firewall was down. Lyra, shaking but clear-eyed, was already at the main console, her hands flying as she linked the Veritas satellite's final broadcast log to the planetary array network. A single command initiated the sequence. In the silent graveyard orbiting the gas giant, the colossal white dishes of the Sector Alpha array began to move for the first time in centuries, their groaning metal echoing through the void as they aligned, power flowing into their ancient circuits. The beacon was no longer silent. It was awake, and it was ready to shout their truth across the galaxy. A low hum built deep within the dead satellite, a vibration that traveled through the fabric of space itself. Then the beacon spoke. It was not a sound but a wave, a pulse of pure information that radiated outwards at the speed of light. It carried two simple, devastating truths. The first was the raw data stream from Dr. Thorne's final log, the Pulsar's coordinates and the precise countdown to annihilation. The second was Kalen's recording, a silent, 60-second loop of a single, steady star against the black. This was the key, the proof that gave the warning its terrible weight. The transmission slammed into the Sector Alpha array, and the ancient dishes, now blazing with power, amplified the signal 1,000-fold, hurling it across the void like a shout from the grave. In Aethelburg, the starfall flickered. It was a subtle glitch at first, a faint shimmer across the perfect black dome, like a screen losing its signal. People on the streets paused, looking up with mild confusion. Then the entire sky dissolved into a storm of static. For 3 heartbeats, the projection failed completely. And the universe poured in. The true night sky erupted above the city, a breathtaking, terrifying vista of a billion suns, the ghostly river of the Milky Way arching over the towering spires. The collective gasp from millions of throats was a sound louder than any siren. Awe turned to confusion, and confusion curdled into a dawning, primal fear as the second part of the transmission reached every public screen, every private data slate, every comms unit in the city. The Pulsar's diagnostic, the minister's secret logs, the brutal math of the evacuation protocols, it all flooded into the open. The lie was not just broken. It was eviscerated. Panic erupted, a seismic wave of terror and betrayal, but amid the chaos something else bloomed. Small groups of people did not run. They simply stood, their faces upturned, their eyes reflecting the starlight they had been told was a myth. They were not looking at a memory. They were looking at their home, a cosmos vaster and more beautiful than they had ever been allowed to dream, even as it held a clock ticking down to their end. The ministry's peace was shattered, replaced by a terrifying, electrifying freedom. The cage was gone, and they were finally, truly awake. The city did not fall silent in awe. It roared. The sight of the true sky, a truth denied for generations, detonated a shockwave of pure, unbridled fury. Citizens who had never questioned a single directive now tore up paving stones and used them to smash the holographic propaganda kiosks that lined the avenues. The air filled with the electric crackle of overloaded Peacekeeper shields and the raw, human sound of a population betrayed. From his vantage point in the spire, Kalin watched the tide turn. The neat, orderly lines of ministry control shattered into 1,000 chaotic points of rebellion. He saw Minister Valerius appear on a central balcony, his amplified voice pleading for calm, for a return to the order that had been their protection. But his words were swallowed by a new sound rising from the streets, a thunderous, rhythmic chant that began in a few scattered pockets and then swelled into a single, city-shaking declaration. "We see the stars, we see the stars." The phrase was not a statement of fact. It was a war cry. It was a rejection of everything the ministry stood for. Each time the crowd chanted those 4 words, another layer of the great lie crumbled into dust. A Peacekeeper's armored transport, once an object of absolute fear, was swarmed and overturned by a mob armed with little more than their rage and the sudden, terrifying knowledge of their own mortality. The ministry's control was not just breaking. It was being systematically dismantled by the very people it had sought to pacify. But as Kaelen watched the fires bloom in the streets below, a cold dread settled in his stomach. This was only the first battle. They had won their freedom from ignorance, but the Pulsar's countdown continued its silent, merciless march. Freeing a people from a cage did not stop the avalanche about to bury them. The real enemy was not down there in the crumbling streets. It was out there in the deep, star-dusted dark, an astronomical executioner on a fixed trajectory. The uprising was a necessary, beautiful chaos, but it was merely the prelude to a fight for survival on a scale they were only just beginning to comprehend. Freedom from the lie lasted for only a single, breathless moment. The beacon's final data stream finished decrypting on Lyra's console, and the numbers that resolved sent a cold spike of dread through the room. The Pulsar wave was not days away. It was hours. The city's newfound chaos was a celebration on the edge of a grave. Kaelen stared at the countdown, a cruel clock that had been ticking while they fought for a truth that now felt almost meaningless. What was the point of seeing the stars if you were only going to be erased by one? Lyra's fingers flew across the terminal, her search growing more frantic. She was not looking for more bad news. She was digging for a ghost of a chance, a forgotten footnote in the mountain of data the Ministry had buried. Her search locked onto a file, its designation simple and stark: Project Resonance. The lead researcher was Dr. Aris Thorne. His voice, older and more strained than in his final logs, filled the silence. Our models suggest the wave has a structural weakness, a resonant frequency. If we can generate a counterpulse of identical energy, timed to the nanosecond, we could theoretically disrupt its coherence. It would be like hitting a perfect musical note to shatter a glass, but the energy requirement is astronomical. The file scrolled on, and the proposed solution stole the air from the room. The only power source in the sector with sufficient output is the Aethelburg energy grid itself, specifically overloading the primary regulator for the city dome. The realization was a physical blow. To save the surrounding sector, to give the ships they had just warned a fighting chance, they would have to destroy the very thing that had protected the city. The dome was not just a shield of lies, it was a colossal capacitor, a battery built to sustain a millennium of ignorance. Overloading it would create the necessary energy burst, but it would also vaporize the grid, leaving the city exposed and powerless. They would be trading one apocalypse for another. They would save countless lives light years away, but for the people of Aethelburg, it meant sacrificing their entire world, the artificial sun, the climate control, the very infrastructure of their civilization, to the cold, unforgiving vacuum of the truth they had just embraced. It was the ultimate, terrible price for looking at the stars. The choice was no longer about truth or lies. It was about who lived and who they were willing to sacrifice to make that happen. The numbers on the screen were a final, brutal verdict. Kaelen stood on a crumbling balcony overlooking the city's central plaza, the roar of the uprising now a confused murmur as the beacon's warning echoed from every screen. He raised his hands, and a fragile quiet fell over the sea of upturned faces, their eyes still wide with the shock of the stars. "The choice is not between safety and danger," he called out, his voice cutting through the cold air. "The safety we were promised was an illusion. The dome cannot protect us from what is coming. It can only doom everyone else. To shield this one city would require overloading the grid, channeling every joule of power into the beacon to generate the counterpulse. The energy to save us all would be stolen from every other world in the Pulsar's path. We would be sacrificing countless lives to prolong our own for a few more hours." His words hung in the air, a terrible, silent weight. A single shout rose from the crowd, "So we just lie down and die." Kalin met the man's desperate gaze. "No, we choose to be more than the lie they made us. We bring down the dome. We channel its entire energy reserve into the beacon, and we use it not to hide but to fight. We give everyone a chance." For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind whistling through the spires. Then, a slow, building wave of understanding moved through the people. It was not a cheer of victory, but a grim, collective acceptance. They had just won their freedom, and now they were being asked to sacrifice the only home they had ever known to protect the very stars they had just discovered. Small groups began to move, not in panic, but with purpose, directing others toward the old geothermal maintenance tunnels, the only shelters deep enough to possibly withstand the coming blast. They were not fleeing the end. They were choosing the shape of their legacy. The city plunged into absolute darkness, a blackness deeper than the Starfall had ever been. Emergency lights flickered on, casting frantic, strobing beams across the control room where Lyra fought to stabilize the grid. "They are in the system," she called out, her voice tight. "Loyalist factions have triggered a cascade failure. The energy transfer is stalling. Minister Valerius moved to a secondary console, his face illuminated by the angry red of system warnings. His hands, which had once signed the orders for their imprisonment, now flew across the interface, inputting override codes only he possessed. "My fear built this cage," he said, the admission ripped from him. "My desire for a quiet, orderly end blinded me to the courage required for a real solution. Now, I fight for the truth I tried to bury." His authority became their greatest weapon, granting them temporary access to subroutines the saboteurs could not easily lock out. Across the city, teams of rogue engineers and former Star Seekers worked in the choking dark of maintenance tunnels, manually rerouting power conduits that glowed with dangerous, overloaded energy. It was a race fought in the shadows, a battle of wits and wrenches against an enemy that knew the city's mechanical heart as well as they did. For every connection they forged, the Loyalists severed another. The countdown to the Pulsar wave continued its inexorable march, each second stolen by blackouts and system crashes. The city's fate, and the fate of every world in the signal's path, now hinged on a desperate, patchwork effort to unite a divided people against the final, vengeful act of a dying regime. The control room lights flickered like a dying heartbeat, casting frantic shadows as Lyra tracked the saboteurs through the grid's labyrinthine schematics. "They are rerouting primary power through the old industrial sector," she said, her voice sharp with urgency. "If they overload those conduits, the entire transfer sequence will fail." Kaelen was already moving, grabbing a pair of plasma cutters from a fallen Peacekeeper. "We have to cut them off at the central junction." The chase led them into the city's underbelly, a narrow service crawlspace humming with raw energy. Conduits snaked along the walls, glowing with a dangerous, angry orange, as the Loyalists forced more power through aging systems not meant to handle the strain. The air grew hot and thick with the smell of ozone and scorched metal. They rounded a corner and found them three figures in Ministry engineering uniforms, frantically welding a bypass into the main power line. There was no time for words. One Loyalist lunged, and Kaelen met him with a tackle that sent them both slamming into a conduit. The metal groaned, and a shower of sparks erupted from a ruptured seal. Lyra dodged a swung wrench, using her smaller frame to duck under the attacker's arm and jam her cutter into the control panel of their makeshift device. The Loyalists' welding torch flared, searing a deep gash across the primary coolant line. With a violent hiss, superheated steam filled the corridor, blinding them all for a crucial second. When it cleared, the Loyalists were down, stunned or unconscious, but the damage was done. The main conduit, critically compromised, now bled energy in chaotic, arcing bursts. "We stopped them," Lyra gasped, wiping coolant from her eyes, "but the grid is hemorrhaging power. We have lost nearly 20% of the transfer capacity." Before Kaelen could respond, a new, more terrifying alarm blared from Lyra's wrist-mounted datapad. Her face went pale. Long-range sensors just picked up the leading edge of the Pulsar wave. "It is accelerating. We have minutes, not hours." The race was over. They had won the battle against the saboteurs, but the war for survival had just entered its final, desperate seconds, with a crippled weapon and a wave of annihilation now visible on their scopes. Kaelen's eyes locked on the failing power levels. "We cannot stabilize the grid in time," he said, his voice cutting through the blaring alarms, "but we have one more power source." He pointed through the viewport at their own battered escape pod, still docked at the spire. "Its core is still intact. We can use it as a battery." Lyra stared at him in horror. "That would mean overloading it from the inside," she argued, her voice rising. "The feedback surge would not just destroy the pod. It would vaporize everything in this spire. We would be at the center of the blast." Kaelen turned to her, the light of the true stars reflecting in his eyes. "The stars are worth it," he said, his tone leaving no room for debate. "They are the truth, and that truth has to mean more than just our survival." He was already moving toward the airlock, his decision a calm, terrible certainty. They sealed themselves into the small pod, its cockpit feeling more like a coffin now than a vessel. Lyra rerouted the last of the systems, linking the pod's core directly to the beacon's transmission array. The console before them glowed a violent, warning red. Kaelen took the controls, his hands steady as he ignited the thrusters. They shot away from the spire, a tiny speck of metal flying not toward escape, but directly into the raging torrent of energy that flowed from the dying city grid into the beacon. As they plunged into the raw power stream, the pod's hull began to scream, the metal groaning under stresses it was never meant to bear. The lights flickered and died, leaving only the eerie, brilliant glow of the energy outside the viewport. The Pulsar wave appeared on the edge of the sensor screen, a wall of cosmic radiation so immense it blotted out the stars behind it. Kalin pushed the throttle to its limit, driving them deeper into the heart of the light. This was not a retreat. It was a final, deliberate act of ignition. Their sacrifice would become the spark, the necessary flame to light a beacon that would outshine the coming dark. The universe outside the viewport vanished, replaced by a solid wall of incandescent white. The Pulsar wave had arrived. It was not a silent tide of radiation, but a physical force, a screaming torrent of energy that hammered against the ship's faltering shields. Every alarm was a single, sustained shriek of metal and circuitry pushed beyond their limits. Then the beacon fired. It was not a weapon's blast, but a single, perfect note of pure energy, a resonant frequency born from Dr. Thorne's calculations and powered by a city's sacrifice. The pulse was a brilliant, expanding sphere of blue-white light that met the oncoming wave not with violence, but with harmony. Where they touched, the pulsar's destructive coherence shattered. The blinding white light fractured into a billion shimmering fragments, a cosmic aurora of dissolving energy that painted the void in impossible colors: violet, gold, and a deep, resonant crimson. It was the most beautiful thing Kaelen had ever seen, a funeral pyre for an apocalypse. The spectacle lasted only a few seconds, but in its wake, the ship was dying. A final, catastrophic shudder racked the escape pod. The main power conduit, overloaded by the beacon's final demand, exploded in a shower of molten metal and acrid smoke. The control panels went dark, their comforting glow extinguished forever. The hum of the life support system choked into a death rattle, replaced by an unnerving silence broken only by the creak of contracting metal and the frantic hiss of escaping atmosphere. They had won. The wave was gone, but their tiny vessel was now a dead husk, tumbling helplessly through the aftermath. Through the cracked viewport, the true stars looked on, indifferent and magnificent. They had saved them, but now they were adrift in their cold, unforgiving embrace. The silence after the blast was a physical presence, thick and heavy inside the wrecked escape pod. Kalen's ears rang, his body aching from the violent impact as the ship skidded across the rocky surface of the planetoid before coming to a jarring halt. Through the fractured viewport, the star-dusted void was serene, the cataclysm they had faced now just a memory written in light. They were alive, but the pod was a dead husk, its systems dark and its hull breached. They were stranded on this graveyard of forgotten technology, the price of their victory measured in their own isolation. Then, a familiar, resonant tone vibrated through the metal deck beneath them. The console, which had been utterly dark, flickered with a soft blue light. The holographic form of the Sentinel shimmered into being, its ancient, serene features regarding them. "The sector is safe," it announced, its voice echoing not in triumph, but in a profound, quiet gratitude. "Your broadcast did more than disrupt the Pulsar wave. It ignited a revolution. Across a dozen worlds, the Ministry's lie has been exposed. Its fleets have been grounded by their own crews, its governors deposed by their citizens. The people are reclaiming their skies." The news washed over them, a tidal wave of relief so immense it felt unreal. They had done it. They had not just averted an apocalypse, they had toppled an empire built on fear. The image the Sentinel projected was not of a single world, but of many. On one screen, a crowd on a dusty colony world gathered under a newly revealed nebula, their hands outstretched as if to touch its colors. On another, the crew of a repurposed Ministry freighter cheered, having just redirected their ship toward the Veritas satellite to join a new, decentralized fleet. The stars were no longer a secret to be hidden, but a common heritage to be shared. Hope was not just a feeling, it was a tangible force, spreading from world to world like a chain reaction of light. The cage was not just broken, its pieces were being reforged into bridges. Yet here they were, on a silent rock at the edge of everything, the architects of this new dawn shivering in a broken ship. They had given the universe its future, but in that moment their own seemed to have ended. The Sentinel's light pulsed softly, as if sensing the duality of their victory. "You have returned the stars to your people," it said. "The question now is what you will do with the dawn." A distant hum grew from a silence they had mistaken for emptiness. At first it was a single bright point of light against the starscape, then another, and another, until a whole constellation of ships emerged from the void, their hulls painted in the colors of a dozen different colonies. They were not Ministry vessels, sleek and predatory, but a ragged, beautiful fleet of freighters and retrofitted scouts, their approach cautious but determined. The lead ship, its hull scarred from what looked like a recent battle, settled onto the planetoid's surface beside their wrecked pod. The airlock hissed open, and a crowd of people poured out, not soldiers but citizens. Their faces were etched with the same awe Kalin had felt when he first saw the true sky, a mixture of terror and a joy so profound it bordered on grief. They did not rush forward with offers of rescue, but simply stood for a moment, their collective gaze fixed on Kaelen and Lyra with a reverence that was almost unbearable. Then, from among them, a familiar figure stepped forward. Minister Valerius looked older, his official robes replaced by the simple, durable clothing of a laborer. There was no trace of the man who had condemned them to the memory-wiped chair, only a deep, weathered humility. He did not extend a hand, but offered a slow, deliberate bow. The entire gathered crowd followed his lead, a silent wave of gratitude. When he spoke, his voice carried across the rocky plain, clear and strong. "You did not just give us back the stars," he said, his eyes holding Kalen's. "You gave us back our courage. You gave us a future we are now free to build for ourselves. The lie is dead. What rises in its place is ours to shape." Kaelen looked from the minister's transformed face to the vibrant, star-dusted sky above. The fight had been for truth, a single, brilliant flash against the darkness. But this, the gathering of ships, the unified gaze of a people no longer afraid to look up, this was something else entirely. It was the dawn after the long night, a beginning filled with both infinite possibility and the sobering weight of what came next. The cage was gone, but the universe waiting for them was vast, unknown, and entirely their own. The scarred planetoid became a university, its skeletal dishes now classrooms for a new generation of star-seekers. Kaelen and Lyra founded the Veritas Institute not as a monument to their own struggle, but as a living defense against the kind of ignorance that had nearly doomed them all. Lyra stood before a massive viewport, a class of young students behind her, their faces bathed in the light of a nearby nebula. "We erased the erasure," she said softly, her voice carrying a profound weight. "The Ministry tried to bury the cosmos under a blanket of lies. Our only true victory is to ensure no one ever has the power to pull that blanket over our eyes again." The thriller of the erased stars slowly transformed into a foundational legend of liberation. Children now learn the story not as a frightening secret, but as a cautionary tale of courage, a reminder that the greatest dangers often come not from the void, but from those who would forbid you from looking into it. The old escape pod was left exactly where it had crashed, a permanent exhibit at the heart of the campus. Students would touch its scorched hull, not to remember the fear of that final flight, but to feel the tangible proof that a single spark of truth could ignite a galaxy. They studied the Pulsar's mathematics not as a countdown to doom, but as a lesson in cosmic stability. They analyzed the Ministry's propaganda as a masterclass in psychological control. The past was not buried but dissected, its lessons woven into the very fabric of their new society. Kaelen watched them, these children of the dawn, and saw them point not just to the familiar constellations, but to the deep, empty black between the stars, asking questions about what might lie in the darkness they had yet to illuminate. The sky was no longer a secret to be uncovered, but a frontier to be explored, and the legend of its erasure was the very thing that guaranteed it would never be hidden again. Months passed in a rhythm of quiet study and growing wonder at the Veritas Institute. The work of rebuilding a society around truth, not fear, was its own grand adventure. Then, the silent, watchful intelligence that was the Sentinel registered a new anomaly. It was not the familiar, destructive signature of the Pulsar. This was something else entirely. A complex and repeating pattern of electromagnetic waves originating from a point so deep in the galactic rim, it had no designation on any star chart. It was not a warning. It carried the distinct, elegant mathematical structure of a greeting. Lyra rushed the analysis to Kalin, her usual calm replaced by a breathless excitement. He studied the signal's elegant harmonics, its clear, deliberate attempt at communication. A slow, profound smile spread across his face, the kind that reaches the eyes and speaks of old wounds finally healing in the light of a new dawn. He looked from the data stream to the star-filled viewport, his voice soft but certain. "The universe is full of secrets," he said. "Let us go find them." The statement was not a wish, but a declaration. The fight to see the stars was over. The journey to truly know them, to meet the neighbors they never knew they had, was just beginning. The silence of deep space was broken by a ghost. A salvage crew, sifting through the wreckage of the final battle near Aethelburg, recovered a scorched black box from the mangled remains of the Wraith. Its casing was fused shut, its memory core partially slagged, but a single, heavily damaged data packet survived. When the engineers at the Veritas Institute finally managed to restore it, a familiar, gravelly voice filled the playback room, strained by static and the roar of his ship coming apart around him. It was Jack's. His final log was not a plea, not a curse at the warship that had him in its sights. It was a calm, clear command, 3 words spoken with his last breath. "Keep looking up." The message was released to the public network, and it spread faster than any official proclamation. It was not a complex philosophy or a lengthy manifesto. It was a simple instruction from a man who had given everything to prove that the sky was not empty. On a dozen liberated worlds, those 3 words were painted on bulkheads, etched into tools, and whispered by parents to their children at night. They became a rallying cry, a solemn promise. Jack's echo was a reminder that the price of their freedom was eternal vigilance, that the comfort of looking away was the first step back into the cage. His sacrifice was not just a moment of heroism in a forgotten battle. It became the foundational principle of a new era, a permanent warning against the seductive lure of ignorance. The human spirit, once content to live under a manufactured sky, now understood that its greatest purpose was to seek, to question, and to always, no matter the cost, keep looking up. The Ministry of Truth was the last structure to fall, its obsidian spire going dark as the final vestiges of control were severed. Across Aethelburg, the great dome flickered one last time and then dissolved into nothingness, its energy spent not on a lie but on a future. For the first time in generations, the night was not a manufactured black, but a living, breathing entity, a canvas of infinite depth painted with the light of a billion distant suns. People did not riot in the streets below. They stood in a silence more powerful than any cheer, their faces turned upward, finally meeting the gaze of the cosmos. The dystopian regime had not been toppled by weapons alone, but by a simple, undeniable act of seeing. One by one, they had chosen the terrifying beauty of truth over the comfortable safety of the cage, and in doing so, they had collectively reshaped their own destiny. Kaelen stood beside Lyra on a high balcony, the cool night air carrying the scent of change. He looked out at the sea of upturned faces, illuminated by starlight, and he understood that their greatest victory was not in surviving, but in awakening. His final words were not a complex philosophy, but a quiet acknowledgement that echoed across the liberated city. The stars were always there, waiting for us to see. This was the ultimate message of hope. The universe had not been their enemy, ignorance was, and now, with the lies swept away, a thrilling and boundless promise stretched out before them. Every twinkling light was a question, every dark patch between them an uncharted frontier whispering of mysteries yet to be solved, of neighbors yet to be met, of a story that was only just beginning.